Good morning. Welcome on this really special Inclusion Shabbat. Our speaker is on her way. And so as we begin, what we're going to do, rather than framing and saying the bracha for learning, we're going to first recite the blessing for learning together. And God willing, she will have arrived by the time we are done. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. V'ha'arevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu u'b'fi amcha beit Yisrael, v'niyeh anachnu v'tzatza'enu v'tzatza'ei amcha beit Yisrael, kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah Adonai, hamelamed Torah le'amo Yisrael.
Go slower here.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai, notein ha'Torah. Well, these words of Torah are actually perfect to begin our conversation because Shelley Christensen, who will be with us, actually provided for us a text that comes from the giving of Torah at Mount Sinai. And one of the things that she's going to teach us about is how this confusion of seeing and hearing comes into play as we start to think about others. And she is here. Yay, Shelly, welcome. Come take your seat. Here we go. Boker Tov, Boker Tov. Good morning. So
you know what? Give me a sec.
So keep going, Michelle.
So okay, so Shelly, put down your things. One of the things that we were talking about last night when I met you was actually you have a story about engagement and inclusion where you were thwarted and you were angry about that. Your first reaction as an inclusion advocate was anger, but it led through the course of study to empathy.
Exactly.
And the texts that you brought us this morning lead us to empathy as well. So I want to ask you to tell us a little bit first about your personal journey and how you came to this inclusion work. And then please teach us these beautiful texts you brought.
I'm more than happy to do that. Hi. It's great to be here this morning. Shabbat Shalom. So I'm, besides being neurodivergent myself, I live with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, anxiety, and depression. I didn't know that, though. I grew up with all these conditions, but I had no idea that they were a thing until our middle son, Jacob, was diagnosed when he was in second grade with ADHD. And in my naivete, I just assumed that the school would take care of all his learning, that it was really up to them, not up to us. And besides that, I was working full-time. I had 2 other kids, busy life. And it wasn't until he was 15 years old, we had open enrolled him in a new school district because the district he was in did not provide him with any sort of support to meet his educational needs. He is someone who would come into class and he would sit and he would take like 5 minutes just to read a book. And it looked like he wasn't paying attention, but really that was his transition to a new class. And he needed that. They didn't understand that. They just kept saying, he's not doing this, he's not doing that. So one day, I got a call. He was, I think, in 8th grade at the time. I got a call from the assistant principal at his school. And it was a Mrs. Christensen call. You've all had them. Although, maybe not Christensen, but you know what I'm saying. By the way, Christensen, the way we spell it, is the Jewish spelling of our name. Anyway, he said, Mrs. Christensen, I'm calling to let you know that I'm giving Jacob in-school suspension today for poking a hole in a concrete wall with a pencil. And my first reaction, and I'm in an office now with colleagues in a sales job that I had, I'm thinking, who's watching him so closely, and is poking a hole in a concrete wall even possible?
It's
what
kind of like Shawshank Redemption. That's
totally,
how they get out
right?
of Shawshank Redemption.
Oh my
It's
gosh,
totally
yes.
Shawshank.
Yes, yes.
Keep
exactly.
going.
Exactly. It's compelling, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, what this assistant principal didn't know is that the summer before this incident, I had taken a class through our Parent Training and Information Center on parent advocacy, and God bless you. Thank you, dear. I knew the law. The law is a powerful tool. I knew the special education law. And there's a foundation for, it's called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and there's a foundation for this, and it is this, that child is entitled to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. So I'm going to say that again. A free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. This was a public school, and I said to the assistant principal, well, I don't understand who was watching him so closely. I didn't know you could poke holes in concrete walls with a number 2 pencil. And if you can tell me how you intend to provide a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment today, then I will agree with you that he can go into in-school suspension. And he just said to me, I guess, Mrs. Christensen, that's off the table. And that triggered something in me. And not just because this was my kid, but for all kids. How dare you deprive a child of their education? And I lost my temper. I know, I look so calm and quiet. and they were out of compliance with special education law entirely. I threatened to lawyer up. Not music to the ears of any public school administrator. And right after that, then there was no in-school suspension. We met with the special education teacher for the school, and we developed a plan for Jake. I wasn't satisfied with that plan, but what happened was this. I was so angry, and I got off that call, and I thought to myself, yay. In fact, I got a standing ovation from my colleagues. It's like getting an Emmy Award, I think. It's prestigious. And I thought, why am I so angry? Yes, I'm angry at this guy. I'm angry at this system, but there's something else here. And I stopped and I went, I am angry at you. I am angry at you, God. Why did you make my child this way? Why did you deprive him of a life of meaning? Now, and that really takes us to where we are today. But the upshot of this is I was so, I don't want to say embarrassed. I was quite proud of my performance, but it concerned me deeply. If I was losing my temper and this was interfering in building collaborative relationships with the people in his life, what about other parents? What was happening there as well? And so I did what any parent would do. I went to graduate school. I got my master's degree in developmental disabilities, and I was close to, I'm not going to tell you how old I was, but I was, I was almost eligible for AARP membership when I went to graduate school. Okay. And, and I spent 2.5 years researching parent response to when a child is diagnosed and how to navigate this. And yes, the anger is directed almost always at one's definition and engagement with a higher power. Almost always. And that's a beginning start. And unless we can navigate that, then it really gets in the way of all these other relationships that we need to have as parents. And I one time, and I'll stop talking after this, because this really is leading to the field that we are here to discuss, the work that we're here to talk about. And I went in to check on Jacob one night. He was probably 16 years old. And we had just had kind of an argument. And I went in to see how he was doing, because I'm, admittedly a semi-helicopter parent, I guess. And he was soundly sleeping. And I looked at him, and I hope I don't get too emotional here, but I just thought, he's perfect the way he is. He's my child. I'm so proud of him. And then I realized this is a cognitive and emotional response that God perhaps is angry at how people treat kids, people with disabilities. Because in God's eyes, there's no distinction between those who are in and those who aren't. That's a human dissertion. And I thought, you know what? I think God is my partner, and God is Jake's partner. And at that moment, that transitional moment, it put everything in place for me because I realized this was a partnership, and it was my responsibility to do what I can as God's partner, not just for my own son, but in the work that I do. And it brings us to the text in a way that, first of all, the foundational text, I think, for all of this is in Genesis 1:26 and 27. We're created in the divine image, all of us. It doesn't say only some of us are. It says that all of us are. And because of that, God is not a one-note entity, is God. God is vast. I would like to say God has many strengths, talents, gifts, just like all of us created in that image. And we have different ways of accessing what is there in front of us. And that brings us to this beautiful text that we're studying today in Parshat Yitro, which I'll talk about a little bit more later just in my talk. And so, yes.
So I was actually going to ask you to unfold that for us with your teaching, because this text that you brought to us this morning is a text about access, right? How do we access and how do we understand and gain empathy through the way we access Torah for others in the way we encounter inclusion in our world? So I'd invite you to share with us your thinking in bringing this text to us.
Okay. Thank you. This is one of my favorite parshiot. By the way, just studying the 10 Commandments, I've studied it many times with my B'nai Mitzvah students. And I chose this verse, first of all, V'chol ha'am ro'im, saw. The nation, the people, the Israelites saw et hakolot, ve'et halapidim, ve'et kol hashofar, saw these voices, these sounds. How do you see a sound? How do you see a sound?
How do you see a sound?
How do you? Let's continue. People who were gathered saw all these things. Did they hear them? We don't know. Does everybody hear the same way? Does everybody see the same way? So I think we have to dig even deeper into the text to understand that hearing and seeing, yes, while they are senses, there are other ways of seeing, other ways of knowing. And a lot of that is internal. And again, that is one of those uniting, and it's a uniting feature created B'Tselem Elohim. And it's also a way of understanding we're not alone in our endeavors, that we have other people around us, and it's not as an individual to say, well, they don't count, or it's to say we all count and we all matter. And that empathy piece really is something that it's got to put the empathy in there, the feeling, the understanding that we are all unique.
So I was speaking with someone as we came into this inclusion weekend, and she said to me, these texts were really great. What do they have to do with inclusion?
Everything.
So I want to ask you, right? Tell us a little bit about how this text teaches us as people who want to be the best we can be at inclusion.
Okay. So this kind of involves taking apart inclusion and what that really means. And I know, and I've been I've been in this work over 20 years, and I've seen the changes in the interpretation of inclusion. And inclusion used to really represent this idea that there are people out there who want to be in the community. In fact, there's I'm not sure if I think it's a midrash. I just have kind of a lot of floating in my head right now. Why? My great friend, the late Rabbi Lynn Landsberg, used to talk about this. She'd say, why do synagogues, why do sanctuaries have windows? Why?
For the light to come in.
For the light to come in. Right. It's not, and it's also not for the people on the inside or on the outside looking in, saying, I wish I could be there. They are the light.
So for us to bring the light outside.
To bring it and to ensure that people that want to be there come in. And we talk about light and brightness. We talk about what people bring. And so inclusion used to mean, and in some places it still does, well, let's open our doors and let those people in. Let's let those people with disabilities and mental health conditions come in and adapt to us. Us being the culture, us being how things are done in a certain way. But that's so, in a way, that's so discriminatory because it creates a situation of us and them. And it others people. So in inclusion, yes, we have a program for those people. We have a classroom for those people, those kids. We have a parents group for parents of kids with disabilities. And I'm not saying these things shouldn't happen necessarily, but what I'm saying is that the richness of community, the light, happens when people are seen, when all people are seen as valued, respected, honored creations of God.
Yeah, see, I thought you were going to say that the windows in the shul were there. I was looking through the eyes of my youngest son who has ADHD, and I thought that maybe the windows were there so that you could jump out during services.
Yeah, that's the other.
Because the services were not working for you to just
Exactly.
sit
It depends
there.
how high
Michelle,
they are.
that's 100%.
Shelley, can I ask you a question? Because I hear a creative attention
Yeah.
in your comments. Should a shul like ours that has small group energy, chavurah energy, etc.,
Yeah.
should we create a special group for interfaith families where they have stuff in common and where they share the same kind of conundrums and opportunities? Or should we not and just say there's no distinction, be part of all families? Or LGBTQ.
Yeah.
Should we have an LGBTQ chavurah? Or should we not, because we want all of our LGBTQ families to be in with our non-LGBTQ families? Right, so could you just speak to that creative tension?
Absolutely, absolutely. There's something called ask the person. And so when we talk about inclusion, it used to be, well, let's do something for. And this is how synagogues and different congregations, different faith organizations, this is what they do. Well, we think there's a need there. We see there's a need there. We've talked to some of the people here, and we want them to engage more. So let's do something for them. Let's create a group. Okay? And sometimes it works, and people think, wow, there are commonalities here, and but it's being a one kind of a one-note commonality, perhaps, by distinction of race, or by distinction of gender, by distinction of being an interfaith family, and so forth. In fact, my husband and I were part of an interfaith group. I don't know if you know this, but my husband converted to Judaism after 18 years, thus making Christensen the Jewish spelling. But but what I'm saying is, yes, there's a need out there. And the essence of going from inclusion to belonging is to have a conversation with people. How can this community be be the place you want it to be a place you want to be. How can we here provide support for you and your family? And from there, is it a group? Would you like to meet with other families? Would you like to meet one-on-one with other families? People might surprise you and say, no, not LGBTQ plus families, but other families whose kids are in the same class as my kids, or others who like to have film discussions and come together, so that we're making this community not one of separate groups that we think need to exist.
So there's no one right answer. It's a conversation.
Exactly. And that's where the creativity actually comes in. And I want to stress this more than anything, is just as we know, Moshe did not have all the answers. I don't know that God has all the answers either. And that's the creativity that we're afforded as well as humans, is to figure it out. There's a wonderful story that Herbie Hancock tells about working with Miles Davis, the great jazz performer. And I want to share it because this is really, again, kind of reinforcing what we're talking about here. In it, Herbie was pretty new working with Miles Davis, and they were performing together in Germany. And Herbie Hancock tells a story about how he was playing and he hit a wrong note. He knew it was a wrong note, and he was thinking, I am never being invited back to sit in with this Miles Davis. My career is finished. This is it. And then he said, Miles took that note and turned it into something. It was that creative thing. It wasn't wrong. He didn't see it as a mistake. He didn't see it as wrong. He saw it as just something that happened, and from there created something beautiful. So what I'm saying is, and it's riffing. We're all, in a way, metaphorically jazz musicians in that sense. We don't have the answers, and it's okay not to have the answers for other people. Other people in conversation tell us.
So how do we do that, right? One of the commentaries that you brought from Rav Itamar Eldar spoke about the idea of seeing and hearing as different ways to experience the world, and that the benefit of seeing what is normally heard is that it expresses. He gave a couple of possibilities for this, but one of them that really struck me was that you could see that there was an objective way to experience the world and a subjective way to experience the world. When it comes to inclusion, right, we're talking a lot about the subjective way. Is there an objective way to get inclusion right?
I think there's an objective way to initiate. I think there's an objective way to communicate. These are the tangibles in a community. So the B'Tselem committee, for example, we were talking about this. I know, I love it. We were talking about this. Who's in the committee? Who's on the committee?
Thank you.
Thank you for all you do. One of the most key things that ties into this, seeing and hearing, subjectively experiencing, is to ensure that there are people with I keep bumping into this. That people with lived experience are on that committee and voice and have their voices heard as well. And that's part of the inclusion initiative, is elevating voices of people with disabilities. Think about this. Just as, it's like, do you want somebody doing something for you, or do you want to be involved in something that's meaningful to you, being part of this congregation and this Jewish community? Do you want other people deciding for you, or do you want to be part of that conversation? And I think that's a subjective piece that can happen. I know Judy Heumann talked about that a couple years ago too, is ensuring that people with lived experiences are present. That's the first thing. The second thing, I think it's so important that often doesn't necessarily get overlooked, but maybe needs some follow through, is to ensure that there's front and center on all communications, whether it's online, whether it's, a statement, a fee statement, whatever it is. Anything that goes out public facing that says we are an inclusive congregation and we want to ensure that people feel that they belong. We provide accommodations. It's like getting that out there. And there's ways to say it too that are, I'm just sort of, I want to get that idea across to communicate that this is that you matter, that your voice matters.
Can I ask you a
Cantor.
question? My favorite of the text that you brought is the second one that starts on page 12.
You know what? I don't think I have that.
I'm sorry,
handout.
it's not page 12, page 8.
Let's go.
The difference between, hearing and seeing, but also something that always fascinates me because you were here last night for Shabbat Alive and you experienced the music. And there is one paragraph that you made my day with this paragraph. It's on page 12 at the conclusion, on the fourth paragraph from the top, that it says that we should abandon our organs, reason, vision, and take a hold of the quality of listening. And you made my day with that, because my week, my year, because I always said that in our own world, coming to services sometimes is leaving the rational outside of the door and experiencing the listening and what that creates inside you. Can you say a little bit more about what you find in differences of hearing and listening?
Yes. Hearing, I think hearing is kind of directed at what's coming in from the outside. So we were at service last night was so moving, so beautiful. And we heard together. We heard the music together. We heard the singing together, the harmonies together. How we listened is unique to each person. And so, in terms of what it means, what the music means and how we react internally, there's some music for some of us is tremendously uplifting. And some of it reminds us of different times in our lives. It really brings back that, perhaps an emotional quality. Listening also, I think, helps drive kind of a physical response in a way of movement and just sort of becoming with the music, which I loved. And I have to tell you, last night, I belong to Bet Shalom congregation in Minneapolis, and we have a Ruach Shabbat once a month. And again, it's with the band, and it's lovely and wonderful. And some of the music, I recognized. I know the prayers from last night. I know the text. To hear it in a different way just gave me this idea. Wow, I wish we experimented more. I wish we had other music, other ways of coming to prayer. And by hearing it, I started just integrating it into my listening experience. And I was listening to what I was saying and how I was feeling. And you can listen to your feelings.
Yeah, thank you. And also, one last comment before one of our senior rabbis talks. This idea that applies to everything in life, including people, which is you're in a conversation, somebody tells you something, you're hearing what you said, but perhaps you're not listening.
Exactly. And pursuant to that, just as you present the music there for everyone, each person has a voice in that music. Everyone there has a voice, whether it's an out loud voice or an inside voice or a feeling. It's a communal experience, and it's different for every person.
Can I pop in? There's something that's so fascinating to me about the verse that you brought, because it presents kol ha'am, the entire people, as if they're this monolithic being that experiences everything the same. And then it shares that they have this synesthesia. They have this out-of-body, strange experience. This extraordinary, this not normative experience that they all share, but that their reaction is fear. And so I want to ask you about, I think there is this drive, there is this sense that we have that, like, as a community, our goal is to give everybody the same experience. And B, when things are different, often people react with anger, fear, like, what have you done? You moved my cheese. Why is this different? I don't like this melody. Like, how do you deal with that fear response when we are trying to build a community and a communal experience?
By listening. I think we're all afraid of change. I mean, but to different degrees. And so when the music changes, when you've davened the same way and all of a sudden a new tune comes in, people are like, who moved my who moved my Oseh Shalom, for example. It's kind of that fear of the unknown that we all experience, and it's a human response. And by that same token, how do we each internalize that fear? Does it stay with us? Do we process it? Do we let it go? And sometimes just having that conversations with people. I think that, going back to the Israelites, I mean, of course they're fearful, and not just because they 400 years of oppression, and now they're sort of free, but they don't want to be free. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. They're conflicted in that way, and now all of a sudden they're in this environment where they're all together, and there's just so much happening, and it's not happening on the ground level per se. It's coming from all around them. They're going to be afraid, and I think acknowledging that fear is key. Yes.
So I have a student who, this goes back to the idea of seeing and hearing.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a student who said to me, the recording that I sent to him was not the same as the recording that I sent to him, a different recording I sent to him. And I said, well, why? He said, well, because the colors aren't right.
Yeah.
So there are people, and I'm not sure, but I think this particular student has ADHD, but he actually, when he hears pitches, he actually visualizes colors that go with those pitches, and if the pitches aren't the same, then the colors are off, which was very. He said, "Can you record it exactly the same?" Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was just saying that I have a student who, when I sent a specific recording, a second recording of a text, he said it wasn't the same. It wasn't right because the colors weren't right. Because this particular student actually, when he hears pitches, he actually sees colors that go along with the pitches, and if the pitches aren't exactly the same, then it's so this idea that the people saw the sounds is actually not as far-fetched as it may sound, may feel to us. But I just thought that's a fascinating way of being in the world where the senses are not necessarily separated.
Exactly.
Right. That's one of the things that I know, Elias, I don't know if it's true with you, Dan and Eliza, when you teach Bar and Bat Mitzvah, you've taken something that we use from originally in order to help people access the text if they have trouble, and you've used it now with all students. So all students get the color breakdown to the Torah tropes, right? Color coding. So what we've done is we've taken the we, right? And I've been mindful all this whole time that you're talking about who is the we, and how this text really helps us to move to it's we, and we're creating access to maybe all of us can be helped by these adaptations, that what would be helpful for one person may actually help somebody else in a way they didn't know it would help them. So fidgets in the back of the room might be helpful for that kid who wants to jump out of the window, but it turns out they might also be helpful to, somebody who is neurotypical, who might just be having a day that they'd like to have something in their hands. And we create these moments where we say that we is all of us, that it's not we and we're helping you. And I just want to give Wes a chance to ask a question, but I wanted to invite you to reflect for just one moment before we get there about that distinction. How do we go from this place where it's we and we're helping you to we are we? And how does this text that you brought us help us get there?
Well, I think first of all, Yasher Koach, listening to a student and responding to that and meeting their needs is really that is really the dugma chaya. Exactly, that is something you all do, and it comes from listening. It doesn't come from, well, I got to sit here and figure out exactly. I know this child isn't acquiring the information in a certain way that I've presented it, the way that we do it for most people. And the learning that comes from that to do it that way for all students acknowledges, I think, the brilliance of the human mind and being able to learn in so many other ways. And so I want to, I think, emphasize that this is really a journey. And the how questions are really important. The how do we, all of us, starting even here in this room, how do we exemplify a culture of belonging? And that's a journey that we take together, the idea of belonging. What does it mean to you to belong? And at study later on this afternoon after Kiddush, we're going to talk about belonging. We're going to talk about what it means to you. So you might even want to think about that now. What does it mean to you to belong to this congregation, to this Jewish community, in other endeavors in your life? What gives you that sense of belonging? And I think that happens. That's a person-centered idea, not an institutional-centered idea. And you need both of these things in place. So start thinking about belonging.
Shelley, first of all, thank you for this really fabulous introduction to inclusion. I have a question, though. It feels to me like a very significant category of challenge is depression, anxiety, rumination, perseveration, OCD, mental illness. And that's not always visible.
Right.
People don't present, people have all these protective mechanisms where they keep their anxiety, their depression, their OCD, their edge inside. So you won't necessarily know. And so a lot of the trope that we've had today about talk to, it's a conversation. You can only talk to when it's a conversation if you know. But if you don't know, you can't have that conversation. And we know that in the wake of the pandemic, therapists are slammed. I mean, they can work 12-hour days, 7 days a week, and not even begin to touch the surface of all the people who need them. That mental illness is the pandemic that has survived the pandemic.
Yes.
So what are your thoughts for specifically the darkness of the soul? The darkness of the soul, melancholy, blue, dark, dark, depression, anxiety. How do we be helpful, particularly when we don't know necessarily, and also when there is still stigma attached to it?
Stigma it's what holds people back oftentimes from disclosing. I mean, it's prevalent. Stigma can also be interpreted as bias and discrimination toward a person. It also can be interpreted by an individual as something, a force outside of themselves that is so pervasive that there's no escaping. And that really stands in the way of being in community. In the research world, there was a great study done by Dr. Mark Salzer at Temple University. You can still access it, and I can send the links after Shabbat to this study. that examines mental health conditions, people with lived experience of mental health conditions, and the role of congregations. And there's a lot of literature out there, but the thing that stood out for me when I read this was that first place, people who are experiencing a mental health condition, maybe in crisis or kind of, getting to that point, the first place they want to turn to is their faith community. So there's that very strong, kind of help me. I need help outside of myself. And just being cognizant of that I think, is a starting point. But I also, people don't necessarily disclose. So how do you know? How do you know if somebody is just, I can't talk about it, I'm afraid to talk about it.
I'm ashamed to talk about it.
Yes, I'm ashamed.
Shame is just a really thick category.
Yeah, it is, and so again, approaching that, I think, in a similar way of inviting people to have these conversations, or just making it a safe space. And how do you make this a safe space for someone who absolutely wants to turn here and is facing so many obstacles to that? I think that's the question, and that's also the question that we encounter with families who have children with mental health conditions. It's that whole safe space, and one of the ways to do that is to do things like this, kind of public information, putting something out there saying this is a safe space. It's, without making another person an example, there may be people who have something to say, who want to say, this has been really helpful for me. I acknowledged I was fearful, I was afraid, I felt ashamed. And I came here and I found the support that meant the world to me. So it really is, again, not looking at, this is kind of, it's a challenge of not looking at this kind of curtain that hides a person with a mental health condition, but sort of gently helping to open that up to seeing that person.
At your synagogue, here's a critique that I've heard about our shul, and I think about shuls in general, which is a problem for what we're talking about, which is a shul like ours is really good if you're on your A game.
Yes.
If you're thriving and if you're healthy and if you're married and if you have 4 perfect kids and if they're all married and if they all have 3 kids and if you have a perfect picture family, welcome to Temple Emmanuel to be with other picture perfect families. But if you've got lots of problems, including mental illness, this is probably not the place for you. How does one that's just such a pernicious and also not true deal. How does one deal with that perception that a synagogue community is for people who are living their A game, when the reality is, and the 5 of us know this, no one's living their A game.
Amen.
Beginning with the clergy, no one's living their A
Right.
game. But how do you deal with the perception that you got to be, living your A game to walk in and feel comfortable?
Exactly. That was, I think, in the beginning of the inclusion movement, that was always, that's kind of how it started, because so many people weren't living their A game, but had to put on this sort of face of A game, and it became increasingly uncomfortable and motivating, actually, to turn to their synagogue or their faith community. Vulnerability is a huge thing. To be vulnerable, where does this start? What is the message that you can give, where one person is going to hear that message and go, okay, you know what? This rabbi knows. This rabbi knows how I feel. Or I'm going to just give this, I'm going to call. I'm going to find out. I'm going to make an appointment. Or I'm going to reach out. I think that it has to come from clergy. Not to say disclose every portion of your life at all. But it comes down to the empathy again, that people maybe don't know that here, this is a place of empathy and understanding. This is not, we're not on a pedestal. People aren't on pedestals looking at the people who feel shame, who feel stigma, who feel marginalized. This is a place where everybody has a place. So, it's maybe even devoting, and kind of looking at the energy around mental health and what this community is doing, talking to RSIP, and looking at what kinds of things are happening in the community to reinforce supporting the people, all the people in this congregation. And I think that I love RSIP, the Ruderman Synagogue Inclusion Project. And I know there's a big focus on mental health. So it's maybe even coming together with other congregations, other clergy, and talking about kind of together, what are you doing? What can I learn from you? This is where we're having challenges.
Well, we're so grateful for the way that you've brought both this text and also your own lived experience to us this morning to help us to feel that we are all kol ha'am. And by being able to see the sounds, that we can have a shared experience that connects us, that everybody has something that we struggle with that makes us different, and that can create the kind of empathy within us for others so that we can be truly inclusive as a community together. And so I want to ask you before we end here to, would you be so kind? Wes, you often ask this. I'm going to ask this today. Would you offer our community a blessing?
Yes. I'm going back to Debbie Friedman's Tifilat HaDerech and the Shehechianu, because journeys start at a place of determination as a first step. And I want to offer the Shehechianu for all of us to say together. Or we can sing it. Do you want to sing it? Because we can hear and we can listen. And I think it's a really good place to start today. Something new, something.
Everybody. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה.
May we be blessed by this community, with this community. This is a loving congregation, a loving home. And it can be a home for all people to belong, all who want to be here, all who are called to be here, all who find that their presence is missed when they're not here. All who have strengths, gifts, talents, cares to share, who need at times in our lives comfort, who need at times a place to rejoice. Just because we're human, just because we're created b'tselem Elohim. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will. And I always end a talk or a blessing with the words of the great Rabbi Lynn Landsberg of blessed memory. May it be our will. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. And to all of you who are on live stream, come join us in the sanctuary. And for everybody who is here in person, you will continue on with your conversation. Those of you who are on live stream, you have two options. You can go to the live stream link, the regular live stream link for the sanctuary, or you can use the special link, which will include closed captioning.